US President Donald Trump has hinted that a recession could be on the horizon amid rising concerns from investors regarding his trade policies. He described the economy as being in a period of transition, highlighting efforts to bring wealth back to America. Market reactions have been volatile as Trump previously imposed steep tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, then later delayed some of the measures, even rescinded them. Recent data shows a significant drop in the S&P 500 index, marking its worst performance in months. Here's President Trump on board Air Force One answering questions.
Are you worried about a recession? Maria Martirello asked you and you kind of hesitated.
I'll tell you what, of course you hesitate. Who knows? All I know is this: we're going to take in hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs, and we're going to become so rich, you're not going to know where to spend all that money. I'm telling you, you just watch. We're going to have jobs, we're going to have open factories, it's going to be great, and the plane is landing. And thank you for a lot of good questions, okay? Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
That's a pretty good reason to end a press conference, isn't it? The plane is landing. What did you make of the substance of his comments there about the recession and the transition to what he says will be the golden era for the United States?
It was amazing. It was almost a shrug of the shoulders, almost, well, who cares? Because, in the long run, we're going to be wealthy. And when all the economic experience of the Great Depression and other recessions have shown that protectionism leads to more of an economic downturn than otherwise. So, you're thinking back to the Great Depression and the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, what a terrible thing they did for the American worker and the rest of the world, and similarly in Australia and other countries. So in some ways, I think his tariff measures are partly foreign policy and they're partly a revenue measure, because I imagine that he's got tax cuts on the horizon as well as the spending cuts. So, as we've warned, I've warned people when I was Austrade chief economist and when I was at the ACTU that tariffs do a lot of economic harm, and I was called a right-wing free trader. Now Donald Trump, is introducing tariffs, and we see exactly the damage they can do.
It's hard to work out which ideology everyone's on these days. They seem to be swapping around. The military hawks used to be the Republicans. Now we're saying that they're the Democrats. And as you mentioned, it was the unions for a very long time who pushed the idea of tariffs to protect jobs. Globalization came along, ended all of that. Now that hasn't worked out for a lot of people who live in middle America, and you could also say in many parts of Australia as well. Talk to us about, if a recession hits the United States, the impact it will have on the rest of the world, because the R word is starting to be used in Australia at the moment too.
Yeah, I think it was Ronald Reagan who famously said a recession is when your neighbour loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job, and a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his. I think people are going to be talking a lot about the R word now. And in some ways, it's come at a bad time because we've sort of got inflation under control. And the thing that Donald Trump's tariffs can do is they can change the outlook on inflation through imported prices around the world and in the United States. And if markets are reacting partly to the imposition of tariffs, but also the uncertainty with sort of on-again, off-again tariff policy, then that could have an adverse impact on employment. So, the tariffs could simultaneously ruin our chances in terms of inflation and in terms of employment. So that's very bad news for the United States and for the rest of the world.
Obviously, reserve banks and the Fed Reserve had been doing their best. They essentially had the mandate to fix inflation, which they have been doing. Blunt instrument, they've copped a lot of criticism. It's gone too far, too hard. In some sectors, we're seeing businesses in Australia really struggle post the lockdowns ending, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. But along comes Donald Trump, as you mentioned, with the tariffs. And a lot of people are pointing to this era being similar to what happened in the late 80s, early 90s, the rolling 80s, the Bob Hawke era, the Alan Bond era, the Christopher Skase era. So much money floating around, so much borrowed money, then all of a sudden it has to get reeled back in. We have Paul Keating, the Australian Treasurer at the time, saying this is the recession Australia had to have. Do we need a recession now? Do we need to get this under control? Will the tariffs force a recession?
Well, we didn't have the high wage and price inflation that we had in the 70s and 80s. We've had low inflation and quite negative, wage situation for a lot of the time, and very low unemployment. And also the current account's not in the same position it was in the 80s and early 90s when Paul Keating uttered those famous words. So I think the conditions are quite different. However, we have had we have had 50 years of prosperity due to having open markets and free trade, particularly in Asia. So Donald Trump could reverse that. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, China put those tariffs on Australia, and we saw the negative impact on the Chinese economy. So I think a lot of countries, China included, have waved tariffs around as a foreign policy sort of punishment for other reasons. And Donald Trump has sort of picked up the ball and run with it. So in some ways, those sort of geopolitical factors are now having an adverse effect on our economic outlook.
Professor Tim Harcourt from UTS and the host of the Airport Economist channel right here on Ticker. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Good to be with you.